I'm Lee Moore, and this is a quick note before we get into this podcast series on the journey to the West. So this was recorded earlier on some slightly worse sound equipment, so the sound quality is a little bit worse. We're still trying to work out how Rob and I record while Rob is in France and I'm in Oregon. Please, as we begin this journey for ourselves, let us know how you're feeling about the podcast, and I hope you'll understand about the sound quality. Now, on to Journey to the West with the Chinese Literature Podcast. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today is the beginning
of a new series.
Of a new journey.
To
the West.
Dun dun!
Xiuji.
We're doing an entire series dedicated just to the Xiuji. This is a single gigantic work. Now, of course,
100 chapters long.
100 chapters long. This, of course, begs the question, Lee, why this work? I mean, you're the one that pitched it to me, and at first I was thinking to myself, okay, I mean, Monkey King, hooray, and all that. I don't really see why this is...
I think previously we had done one podcast on Journey to the West.
Yeah.
It was in our salad days as a podcast.
We were still using really cheap equipment and the whole thing.
Now we're using slightly less cheap equipment.
Yes, exactly.
But this novel is one of the defining novels in not only Chinese literature, but really more East Asian literature.
Right.
And I say that a lot of the writers who we talk about actually ridicule this novel, Journey to the West, as kind of like kids' literature, kind of look askance at it. It's kind of, it's looked at as something that's not...
It's escapist fiction. It's not serious fiction.
And that, I think that's a fair description of it. But what's interesting is this novel has had such a profound effect both in China but also outside of China. In Japan, you have lots of remakes of this novel that have, they've transmorphed into television series. So Pokemon and Dragon Ball Z, both to a certain degree, are reinterpretation of Xiuji. This novel.
They're reinterpreting a dynamic which you and I are going to talk about in a later episode. A dynamic that also is connected a little bit to the way superhero fiction works, where there's a certain way to understand how the genre works, and if you don't know how it works, it can seem really silly. But, you mentioned it being so popular in East Asia. Just in China alone, there are dozens of film and TV adaptations, even more manga and other printed media adaptations. I think you and I were talking once, the earliest film produced in East Asia was a version of one of the stories.
The earliest feature-length
film,
if I remember correctly.
Yeah. And, it's interesting. You talk about the impact in East Asia. There are, just in China alone, dozens of film and TV adaptations, manga adaptations, children's books. It just goes on and on. And its impact in Asia in general is such that I remember when I was sitting in my office once, I had a picture of the Monkey King, the main character, the most popular by far character in the novel,
Absolutely.
up on my computer. And she came walking by, a colleague of mine came walking by, who's Thai, and she said, "Oh, I know who that is. He's a part of it." She kind of fumbled for what exactly it was, but she recognized the character immediately, because in other countries in East Asia, there are adaptations as well. So much so that even if you don't read it or study it, you know it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the interesting things about this novel is how far it's traveled. You have a lot of insularity, I would argue, in Chinese literature, that it doesn't necessarily travel that well outside of China. But these novels, so Journey to the West, but also novels like Jinping Mei and some of the Pu Songling stories really do have this wider influence.
Yeah. And the other thing that's interesting about this one in particular is its international character. The novel is about the importation of the Buddhist scriptures into China, which is a real thing, right? Buddhism isn't Chinese. It started out in India.
Despite what Chairman Xi actually says, that it's a Chinese religion, right?
I love that. Yeah. And you apparently haven't read Journey to the West. How interesting. And a lot of the language that is used throughout the Chinese as well, but in the English translations, uses loan words from other languages. It's a very international novel.
In fact, the importation of Buddhism brought in as many, if not more, new words to Chinese as did sort of modernity and the importation of English words into Chinese.
Right. So this is the first podcast in the series, and I'll just sort of forecast what the rest is going to be. We're going to spend a couple of podcasts talking about the actual content of the novel, and we are going to spend one podcast talking about one particular film adaptation.
Popular reception in general,
exactly. but popular reception in general, but I would say there are probably a handful of films that are the most popular, and one in particular I think is the most interesting. We'll talk about that. But to kind of set it up, this is the story of the importation of the Buddhist scriptures into China. Specifically, it's a journey, like it says in the title,
to the West.
To the West. Again, as it says in the title, of a monk and his 4 acolytes, his 4 followers.
So the monk's name is, he has, all of these characters have multiple names, but we're just going to refer to the monk as Tongue Monk. Mm-hmm. The monkey, we'll just call Monkey. Then there's also Pigsy.
Who's a pig.
There's Sandy, who
is a monster that comes from a lake of sand.
And doesn't really have much of a role.
No.
He's not a secondary character. He's almost a tertiary character.
A non-existent character.
And then there's the horse of Tongue Monk,
who starts out as a dragon and it turns into a horse and has no real function aside from being a couple
of things, but
But for all intents and purposes, this is a story of their adventures going to pick up the Buddhist scriptures in the West.
Every time that a new episode starts, and each episode is normally 2 or 3 chapters long, it'll tell you the season, and then you meet a monster or something. And the novel is really in some ways it's kind of boring. Because you're constantly repeating the same thing. This is actually, it feels like a serialized television show.
Yes. Now, what's interesting about that, though, is a lot of these sort of genre television shows, science fiction, fantasy, detectives, stuff like that, can be immensely popular within an incredibly rigid formula. So my wife loves the show Midsummer Murders. But for me, it's intensely boring because every single episode is the same plot, really. In the beginning, someone's murdered, they find the body, the detective has to... It's the same sort of thing again and again. But if you like the formula, you can watch, 100 episodes of it.
Yeah.
And this novel is very similar. We'll talk a little bit about a way to understand that formula later so that it's not boring. But if you don't know the formula, and the first time I tried to read this was in China, to be fair, it was an awful translation. Foreign Languages Press was a horrible translation.
Yeah, Beijing Foreign Language Press just anything you get from them, you should just...
Not great. Yeah. Not great stuff. I made it through like 20 chapters or something, and I had to put it down. I was like, this is the same thing. So it usually works. The formula is they are journeying west. They encounter an obstacle, usually a supernatural one.
It's usually a monster.
The characters usually react in a similar way. Monkey, or the Monkey King, or Sun Wukong, is an immensely powerful figure. He usually tries to fight, attack, kill, destroy to get his way out. Sometimes it works.
Pigsy is normally eating something, or he's very horny, but he is also a sort of powerful figure. He attacks, he
saves Monkey several times.
Yeah, it's all the exact same thing. I mean, you mentioned that the sort of superhero realm.
Right.
It reminds me of a lot of the superhero shows I watched growing up on Saturday morning, where it's always just the same, like variations on the same theme.
And, for as much as the Marvel universe, film universe now gets a little more critical acclaim, it's kind of the same thing. I mean, someone has a special suit, a special power, they fight evil, they win.
And there's always like a special stick or a special
tool, something. Anyway, but like we say, if you like the formula, it can be immensely popular. Now, the other reason to talk about this novel in depth is, yes, the popular impact, but also when you have a formula like this, and it is as popular as it is, it can tell you a little bit about the culture and the readers that encounter it, that enjoy it.
So before we get into discussing a specific part of the novel, what translation?
We're using what I think is unquestionably the best, which is by Anthony Yu, Y-U. It's the only translation in English of the entire novel, poems included, all the way through.
Arthur Waley, who is a sinologist from earlier times,
yes.
Much earlier times.
Early 20th century, early to mid-20th century.
He translated much of the novel, although not the complete thing.
And didn't translate the poems.
Yeah, which is a problem because poems make up a huge amount of this novel, just the actual space of the novel. So Anthony he just recently, in the past couple of, I think within the past decade, finished this translation of the complete thing. He's a former religion professor at Berkeley. We find his translation stunning.
It's incredible.
Highly recommend it.
One of the things that recommends it is the way he brings to bear, like a lot of the names of things, he includes non-Chinese languages, which definitely helps you to understand the international character of the novel. He does a great job of demonstrating why the novel's literary. Like, all the poems in classical Chinese writing, if you included poetry, it meant, I want you to take this seriously. And if you take the poems out, so Arthur Waley's version is fun. If you're just looking for a fun read, that's kind of where you go. But if you're looking to read this as a piece of literature, then you pretty much have to read Anthony Yu's translation.
I mean, you could read the original.
Well, yeah, you could read the Chinese. It's funny, though, because you mentioned the Chinese. I did read, time constraints being what they are, I wasn't able to read the whole thing, obviously, in Chinese. But I read several chapters in the original Chinese.
差不多.
And one of the things that's fascinating about the language of this novel is it's definitely newer. It's definitely more modern than what came before it. So I'd read some of the Outlaws of the Marsh or the Water Margin, Shui Hu Duan, yeah. That feels older, more archaic. Journey to the West Chinese and the way it works just simply feels newer.
So they're both technically vernacular, but the Shui Hu Duan, the Outlaws of the Marsh, is much more like it just has lots more classical embedded in it. Is that?
Yeah. It has more classical, and like, for example, there's not as much time spent describing random scenery or little subtle details. Like in Journey to the West, at least in the Chinese, you'll get episodes where the Monkey King will sort of grin out the side of his mouth and just drop something on the grass and walk away. And if you've read the rest of that chapter, you go, oh, I see what he's doing, right? It's a very subtle move. Or you may just have a description of scenery just to have a description of scenery, right? It doesn't always tie into everything that happens in the story. Before, that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah. Classical Chinese is a very, it's a language that tries to cut out as much as can be cut out.
So we're also, the other reason this novel is so important is we're getting into a period of Chinese literature when novels, as we think of them, are coming to be a thing in China. Not a lot of episodes all strung together in one place, which is arguably what Outlaws of the Marsh is. But an actual sustained narrative with characters, some kind of subtlety, some sense of this whole huge thing that I'm writing is a single narrative.
What you're talking about is narrative arc, right? So can I ask you, I mean, we've spent most of this podcast introducing this novel.
Yes.
One of the things that makes the arc of a narrative arc is that characters grow.
Yeah.
Do you think that the characters in this novel grow?
That's a good question, and we'll get to that, I think, in the podcast where we talk about the end of the novel. There is change, particularly at the end there is change. Do they grow? Not necessarily.
It's pretty minor, isn't it?
It's very, very minor. But there is, like I say, the ending, there is some change, right?
Yeah, they are, at least Monkey is good enough to become a kind of Buddhist holy figure in the Buddhist pantheon. Pigsy, he gets a lower position, but he is at least not sleeping with anything that has legs, which is where he starts out. Right,
exactly. And we should point out, as we start to kind of wrap this up, if you haven't read any of this story, you're not familiar with any of it, it is a journey to the West. You have characters who are having adventures, battling supernatural powers to go get the Buddhist scriptures, yes. But the other thing it is a search for enlightenment. So each of the characters attached to Tong Monk are there to essentially earn enlightenment, to earn a place out of some form of punishment or imprisonment.
And we'll talk about that more in the next episode.
So it is also a kind of a running example of how a person can struggle towards enlightenment themselves. So it's a story of the Buddhist scriptures. It's also a story of the individual seeking salvation.
And there are some interpretations of the novel that suggest that Tang Monk and his band of 4 merry monsters is actually a symbol of an entire person. Tang Monk being the sort of intellectual seat in the brain, Monkey being the sort of rage center of the human emotion, Pigsy representing the more carnal appetite. So that this entire novel is about Tang Monk learning to control these monkeys, which is actually a metaphor for the individual learning to control their appetites.
Right.
And there's a very Buddhist message in there. Right?
Well, and it is, and we'll talk about this. I keep saying we will talk about this. This will be the last thing I say, because otherwise we'll get into dozens of others we'll talk about this. One of the things that was striking to me reading the novel this time around, and this is partly to do with Anthony Yu's translation, partly to do with I was trying to read as much as possible actually in Chinese, is there's a poignancy to this struggle. This is what I would say in response to your question about change or about growth. I don't know that I see too much change, but there is an awareness of a struggle being more than just the struggle you're reading on the page. This is not just, how does Monkey win so they can keep going? This is, Monkey is struggling with himself. There are episodes where it's clear that Monkey or Pigsy or any of the others want to be doing different things, want to be acting differently, but they're unable to. They're incapable of it. Tang Monk himself, who's, as we'll talk about, is one of the most boring people in the universe, has no appetites whatsoever. He just sort of
he's pretty much a blank slate.
Yeah, is also working. How do I control things? How do I get these scriptures, but also help these disciples attain enlightenment? There's a poignancy to it that you see lacking in most other stories of this kind earlier times.
We should point out that Tang Monk, the figure, is drawing off of earlier figures. Yeah. Tang Monk cries a lot, which we've actually he's very much a crybaby. Yeah. And we've done a podcast on Mulian, who
the great Magdalena saves his mother from hell.
Yeah, so Mulian is one of the earliest figures in narrative Chinese vernacular fiction. It's incredibly popular for almost 1,000 years, and Tang Monk seems to be kind of based off of Mulian, right?
Right. We'll talk about it in the podcast on characters. But to wrap it up here, if you're looking to kind of follow along here, you can find a copy of Anthony Yu's translation anywhere. He does have a single volume, sort of, not really synopsis. Yeah, greatest hits, just called Monkey. And it's still Anthony Yu, so it's going to be worth reading, so you can follow along that way. Join us as we journey.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.